Okay, now we will add AddRow handler. So this AddRow handler will add a new row to the data grid view. Actually, the data table, and the data grid view renders that data table with the newly added row. So what user will do, they will enter title ID, type, and then description. Then they will click add row. So the .NET Core or in the AddRow handler, we will create a new row based on the supplied data, title ID, type, and description. Then the data row will add it to the data table, which is part of the data set. Then we are refreshing we are going to refresh this data grid view so that the newly added row get displayed here. While we are doing so, we are going to test the behavior of a unique primary key constraints on the data table. Okay, let us start. First, let me load the data. So this is the operation sequence that I am going to do. First, I will pick a option here, whether I will load the data with no constraint or with unique or primary key constraint. After loading the data, I will try entering the data here on these text fields. Then I will try to add a new row to the data table and see how it behaves when there is a constraint and when there is no constraint. Before we move, we'll pick through the code here, which is written for this AddRow. In the previous video, you already saw the code for load data and clear. So in this video, I'm going to explain the code written for this AddRow. So let me just double click this. So we will end up with the btn add click. Here if you see, by this time, we already have the data set filled with the data table called titles, and the data table is linked to the data grid control, which is part of the form, this control. Now when I click btn add, I'm just taking the data table again from the data set because the data set is declared global. So from that title data set, I am taking the data table, which is nothing but the select statement of titles table in the pubs database. Okay, now we are having the data table on hand. Then what I'm doing, I'm just from DT title, I'm creating a new row from data table. So now we have data row. After that, from the form data, I'm filling those title row. So I'm naming this as title ID, title, and type. So if you go back to the load click handler, btn load data click handler. So this is the select statement we are using to fill the data in the data set through adapter fill method. So this will be the column name. So what I'm saying here, I'm referring the same column name here, title row, because we are getting a new row from the data table, which is part of the title data set. And if you remember, this data table is already set as a data source to the data grid view. So when we are going to test, first we will select the radio button, then we will click load. That means our data grid view is already holding the data table as in its data source property. So now with the title data set, I am grabbing the same data table, then I'm creating a new row. Then from this form data, I'm filling those columns, title ID, title, and type, from text box entries which user entered. So now we have data row on the fly, which is in the memory. Now what I am saying from DT title is the one we are getting it from the data set. So we are using rows collection Then we are adding a new entry to this row collection. This rows collection will already have the data retrieved from the database through adapter fill method. So in addition to those retrieved data from the database, we are adding a new row on the fly, which get formed dynamically by the user on the click of add button handler. When they click add handler, a new row get formed, then which will get added to the rows collection. So the rows collection will have new row. Then what we are doing, so by doing this, the data grid view will not get refreshed. So to refresh the data grid view, what we are doing, we are making call to ASUP changes. The ASUP changes will in turn refreshes the data grid control, because the data grid control is bound with this data table, so that it start reflecting the changes that we have made here dynamically. So that's the functionality here. The add button handler, it does just grabs the data table, forms the new data row, then adds that row to the collection of data table. Then it asks to refresh the bound control, which is data grid view. So this functionality we want to test in 3 different behavior: when data table is loaded without any constraints, and what happens if it is loaded with a unique constraint, and what happens if it is loaded with a primary key constraint. All right, let's go ahead and run this. So here is the sequence I'm going to do. First, I'm loading the data. Okay, data is loaded. So these are all the data rows in the data table, which get rendered into this data grid view, because the data grid view is bound to the data table. Now, let me add TC 777. If you see, this is the existing row. We are adding constraint to this title ID only, but for this time, since I selected a no constraint, there will not be any constraint. So I'll be selecting category 01. Then description, I'm adding new book 01. Now what I'm doing, I'm clicking an AddRow button. So this will create a new data row based on the data entered here. Then it will add that new row to the data table through rows collection. Then through ASUP changes, that will get reflected into this data grid view. So I'll click add row now. And if you see, a new book is added. This time, there is no complaint that unique constraint violation. But because when we click the load data button, that time we doesn't apply any constraints to the data table. All right, now let me go ahead and clear the data row and data grid view, everything. Then I will load the data with unique key constraint. So here I'm loading. Then I'm going to do the same step, TC for 7, type category 01, new book 1. So this time you will get a constraint violation error. Why? Because when I click add row, it tries to add a new row, but the data table already has a constraint on this title ID column, and that constraint is unique constraint. So if it is unique constraint, then we are not allowed to repeat the same value on that particular column. So if I click add row, I will say that value TC77 is already present. Column title ID is constrained to be unique. So that's the information I'm getting. Suppose if I go ahead and change this to 9 or something, and if I click add, it will be allowed. All right, let me go ahead and clear, and I'll check primary key. So the behavior will be same. So it will not allow. It says still it is saying the constraint to be unique. Now I'll put 9 and I'll click add row. It will allow. Now you may wonder, there's no difference between unique and primary key. The difference comes when we actually merge the data with the existing data table. That we will see in the next article, and you'll understand what's the difference between unique and primary key constraint that's applied to the data table. All right, I'm closing this video now.